the Rights Project.
Freedom Rights Project.
Freedom Rights Project.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be allowed to speak here today following such distinguished speakers. There are so many issues related to freedom of expression to pick up from the press freedom report. So it's you know, you could so many victims of human rights abuses, so many countries that deserve to be named and shamed. But I will focus on one of the areas that I would like to think that I know a little bit about, which is that of more controversial instances of speech. For instance, speech that is deemed offensive to religions, to different groups that may be seen to advocate terrorism and the like. Because we're never in doubt where if someone is jailed for criticizing the government or is being tortured because of political views, you know, there's no doubt that international standard of human rights has been violated. That's not the question. But on these issues, even in liberal democracies, we have debates on where the limit should be, and we also have huge debates in the international community, for instance at the United Nations, of where should the limits go on what you can be allowed to say about religions. For instance, we've seen that, and I'll get back to that. And I believe that how we handle that in liberal democracies or in free states will have a huge bearing on how these issues can be handled in non-free states. Because if we go too far in free states in allowing states to repress even controversial speech, we serve a perfect justification for non-free states to restrict political speech and point to free states saying, well, so do you. But I think one of the interesting things on these issues is to look at how free and non-free states go about repressing controversial speech, which of course is a very broad category. You could say that in non-free states, it's basically used, these laws, for instance, are used to prohibit the spread of democracy, to hinder human rights defenders in entrenching democracy, whereas in free states, these laws are used, at least formally, that the idea is to protect democracy from those who want to abuse these rights. So that's an important difference. We can then have different opinions on whether you actually defend democracy by punishing those with odious views. I think another difference is that even we see increasingly in free states that there are threats against free speech from non-state actors, but I think again, a crucial difference between free and non-free states is that those that are threatened by non-state actors in free states are generally protected by the government. So even if you have very odious views, you will be protected by the police, by the intelligence services. In Denmark, for instance, we have quite some experience with that these days. Whereas in many non-free states, you have, first of all, a lot more non-state actors who operate with impunity, or even sometimes active encouragement of state parties, which of course leaves those that are threatened between a rock and a hard place, because they don't get protection, and they may run afoul of legal standards, but their views may also be so controversial as to engender the wrath of non-state actors, and so they're largely defenseless. So that's another key difference between free and non-free states. Let me start by some of the issues that I think are relevant first in free states and also in Denmark. And then I'll wrap up towards the end with pointing to some standards, international human rights standards, that I think if we can reach a consensus on those, would actually improve the protection of free speech, both in free countries but also in non-free countries. Let me start by the issue of terrorism. Of course, the issue of terrorism and national security laws has had a huge impact on freedom of expression post 9/11. Here in Denmark, we have seen a Kurdish TV station, Rush TV, being convicted for assisting terror in the Danish city court, a municipal court. The case will be heard again this summer, but what was interesting about this decision is that the court based its decision on the fact that it found the broadcasts of this particular station biased, one-sided, and that they were glorifying PKK, which in my opinion is a terrorist organization, but they were not attaching weight to any economic liaison between this station and the PKK. So basically the fact that it was edited in a certain way so to represent PKK in a positive light was sufficient to convict this TV station for assisting terrorism. What has happened since then is that a regulatory body, the Danish Radio and Television Board, which interestingly enough in 4 instances found that this particular station did not run afoul of the law, but then the Turkish embassy kept putting pressure on the Danish government. So it's also interesting that it has sort of a political angle, but that law has now been changed so that this regulatory authority administratively is allowed to revoke the licenses of radio and TV stations that assist terrorism. And again, the standard of assisting terrorism is very vague, unclear, and creates a danger of arbitrariness, basically, and could have a chilling effect on how Danish media cover terrorist cases, which of course are cases that have a huge public interest. We also see some of these things in other free states. Last year in the United Kingdom, a woman was convicted to 1 year's imprisonment for downloading Inspire magazine, which is the magazine produced by Al-Qaeda, which of course is not a very pleasant magazine. But this woman was not, there was no evidence that she was involved in terrorism. This was admitted by the judge. But the simple fact that she downloaded this magazine and it was found on her iPad or mobile phone was sufficient to convict her to 1 year imprisonment, which is a very, very harsh, sentence. And in my opinion, I think that even though Inspire magazine clearly advocates violence, I don't think the fact that you download it should be sufficient to convict you. I could well imagine that I would be interested in reading what's in Inspire magazine, but I think I won't do that since I'm going to London next week. In France, we've seen a cartoonist who drew a cartoon shortly after 9/11, where you had a plane flying into Twin Towers, and there was a caption saying, "We all dreamt about it, Hamas did it," and that was obviously morally reprehensible. But again, this person was convicted, and actually the European Court of Human Rights found that this was not a violation of free speech. I would say that even in the United States, with its First Amendment protection, I would say that there have been some Supreme Court cases where I think the First Amendment protection has perhaps been pushed a little bit, and where the material support doctrine has been moved into areas where it could impinge on political speech. And I would also say that the noises coming out of Washington during the WikiLeaks affair suggested to me sort of basically ideas both from Republicans and Democrats that WikiLeaks could and should be prosecuted under Espionage Act, I think, shows that in the age of terror, national security laws will continue to have an impact on freedom of expression. In liberal democracies, again excepting the United States, all European states, for instance, criminalize certain forms of so-called hate speech, although there are great variations in the scope and wording of such laws. Here in Denmark, it's interesting to note that from 1939 until 2000, there were 10 convictions under our hate speech laws. From 2000 to 2012, we've seen, I believe the number is more than 70 now. So even though it's not a daily occurrence, we've seen quite a notable increase in such conviction, and that also includes members of parliaments, journalists, editors, and so on. And this, of course, we also see in other Western countries where we see people being convicted for controversial statements on issues such as immigration, multiculturalism, and religion. And again, what is noticeable is in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, for instance, does not protect so-called hate speech, but it has failed to define what hate speech is. So basically, the member states have very broad, have a very broad access to itself define and implement hate speech laws that can have a detrimental effect on press freedom and freedom of expression in general. And what I think is also interesting is that the Council of Europe, the European Union, and also most human rights organizations actively support hate speech bans and often argue in favor of broadening them. As far as I know, the press freedom report from Freedom House actually it counts against Denmark and other states that we have these kind of laws, if I'm not much mistaken. So I applaud you for having a First Amendment approach to that. I think a disturbing development in liberal democracies, not least here in Denmark, is what I mentioned before, the threat from non-state actors in the shade of religious extremists targeting journalists, newspapers, and cartoonists, which of course in Denmark has followed the publication and the republication of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a Danish newspaper. We have seen numerous very, very serious terrorist attacks foiled. One cartoonist was lucky to escape when he was attacked in his home. According to the Danish intelligence service, the threats against Denmark from terrorist organizations, both domestic but also outside Denmark, for instance Al-Qaeda, is higher today than in 2006 when the cartoon crisis was culminating, which I think is obviously having consequences for how daring journalists and newspapers dare be. It's been a while since I've seen a republication of the cartoons in a Danish newspaper. And I think when we saw the violent reactions to the incidents of Muslims and also the torching of the French newspaper Charlie Hebdo, I think that we can say that this problem will not go away anytime soon. But of course, despite these limitations in free states, the challenges for journalists, bloggers, artists, human rights defenders are undeniably much more serious in many partly free and in particular non-free states. And of course, the 2013 report includes no shortage of horrifying examples of people being subjected to censorship, draconian punishments, and violence. Even though you might in Denmark be convicted for hate speech, for instance, you're most likely to get a fine, whereas in many other countries in the world you may never see the light of day again if you criticize the government. That's obviously a very big difference. So what do we do about countering this? I think one of the ways could be by promoting and enforcing human rights standards such as Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But of course, for more than a decade, the limits of free speech in this particular area has been very contested, specifically at the United Nations. We had, since 1999, and for more than a decade, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, the OIC states, have tried to, or had successfully pushed through resolution on defamation of religion, which was essentially an attempt to create an international blasphemy law under human rights law. That ended in 2011 when there was a compromise resolution brokered by the OIC and the United States. And rather than countering defamation of religion, it counters discrimination and so-called negative stereotyping of religious believers. But the wording of this resolution is quite ambiguous, and I think it's far from clear that the adoption has really brought about this consensus that if you ask the US administration, they will say, well, we reached a consensus, we're no longer in disagreement. I'd like to demonstrate this by quoting two representatives speaking about the very same resolution in February at the Human Rights Council. The first was the US representative, which hailed this resolution 1618, this supposed compromise. It was labeled a remarkable achievement, and the international consensus on this issue offers a practical and effective means to fight intolerance while avoiding the false choice of restricting the complementary and mutually dependent freedoms of religion and expression. So basically, the US representative here is saying that, well, we've convinced the rest of the world to adopt a First Amendment standard. That would be a very remarkable diplomatic achievement if that indeed was the case. Then you have the Pakistani representative, which also represented the OIC, which stated at the very same session, stereotyping or defamation of religions is a contemporary manifestation of religious hatred, discrimination and xenophobia. While the freedom of expression is sacrosanct, it must not be exploited to incite hatred against any religion. So basically, the OIC is saying basically the same that they've always said. They're just now saying, okay, we won't go along with defamation of religion. What we'll say is that this is hate speech, which is prohibited under Article 20 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But the goal is the same, and that is confirmed by numerous statements by the General Secretary General of the OIC and the foreign ministers of the OIC. And so the burning question is, how should we interpret Resolution 1618 and Article 20 of the ICCPR? And the outcome of that may have very serious consequences for media, for artists, for dissidents, for human rights defenders. Egypt is a good case. We just saw that Egypt got downgraded from partly free to non-free, and we recently saw several Egyptian human rights NGOs issue a joint report saying that actually the respect for freedom of for human rights in general, but also for freedom of expression, is worse during Morsi rule than under Mubarak, when we all know that was pretty bad. One of the examples is that now more people are being prosecuted for insulting the president and Islam than during Mubarak. And I think the fact that bloggers and journalists are being prosecuted for both offending Islam and the president, the same person, shows that laws against religious offense are being exploited to limit criticism of political figures and policies in countries where religion and politics are intertwined. And that is, of course, very relevant following the Arab Spring, where we've seen both in Tunisia and Egypt, and probably also in Libya, that Islamists will definitely be part of the picture there. It is, of course, also very much true in countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, where you have a government that represents an official state religion that has very, very limited and if not zero tolerance for variations thereof. We also see that attacks on religious minorities such as Christians and Ahmadi Muslims by non-state actors in countries such as Indonesia and Pakistan. We see that blasphemy laws tend to cultivate a culture of intolerance rather than social peace, and that they may actually legitimize mob violence. But of course, not only in the Muslim world, where we see that laws protecting religions or religious feelings are being used to target political and artistic speech. In Russia, you had an art exhibition that included some unusual and shocking representations of Christian symbols, and that was attacked by Orthodox extremists. And rather than prosecute the extremists who smashed this exhibition, the official response led to the museum curator being convicted of religious hatred. And of course, Pussy Riot, they were not just convicted of disturbing the public order, it was also motivated by religious hatred, and thereby sending a clear signal that strong criticism of the Orthodox Church, which has very cozy ties to the Putin regime, is off limits. And I think it should be clear that such instances of censorship and repression cannot be allowed to be justified under international human rights law without that very concept losing all meaning. So how do we ensure that exceptions to freedom of expression are interpreted narrowly and won't be able to justify such arbitrary restrictions on religion and political criticism? Well, I think that, in fact, the Human Rights Committee in 2011 issued a general comment on Article 19, General Comment 34, which is very interesting and which holds great promise if it can be implemented as a consensus. It explicitly states that blasphemy laws are a violation of Article 19, that journalists should not be penalized for reporting on terrorist activities, and that any restriction on freedom of expression must be absolutely necessary, and that there's no margin of appreciation. So I'll come back to that. That basically means that is a way to say to the Strasbourg court that you are soft on this issue. So not only would this interpretation effectively end the OIC attempt to smuggle a blasphemy ban in through the back door of human rights, but it would also strengthen the freedom of expression in European states, because the General Common sets a significantly higher threshold for restricting free speech than what follows from the European Court of Human Rights, which does not, very often at least, protect blasphemy, and has developed this broad interpretation of hate speech and offers little protection against anti-terror laws infringing on free speech. Take, for instance, the example of the Turkish pianist Fasil Say, who was recently convicted in Turkey for insulting Islam and Muslims for some tweets. If he brought his case to the European Court of Human Rights, it's by no means certain that his freedom of expression would be protected based on previous case law, where the European Court of Human Rights has said, well, you can't gratuitously offend religious feelings. But under the general comment issued by the Human Rights Committee, Mr. Say's freedom of expression would most certainly, almost certainly be protected. It, of course, also has the advantage of being drafted by the Human Rights Committee, whose members are individual experts hailing from all regional groups, including 4 or 5 members from OIC states, and therefore cannot be dismissed sort of as a Western concept being imposed on others. So while I personally believe there are compelling reasons to advocate for the protection of even hate speech, General Comment 34, I think, forms the best possible basis for a consensus that would significantly strengthen press freedom globally in free as well as non-free states. And if this were the case, if we could reach a consensus, if we could get governments to adopt that as an official policy, perhaps it would be a step towards reversing the worrying trend of diminishing press freedom, which is, of course, almost always a harbinger of decreases in freedom in general. So thank you very much.